I walked into a title company's conference room on a Thursday morning, flanked by two uniformed police officers, while my mother, my brother, and a couple I'd never met in my life sat around a table with a stack of paperwork ready for signatures. All of it built around the sale of a house I owned free and clear. Nobody in that room, including the buyers, had any idea I existed until the moment I walked through the door. I want you to sit with that for a second, because it took me 3 weeks of quiet, careful work to make sure that moment landed exactly the way it did. My family had sold my house, my paid-off, mortgage-free, entirely in my name house, without telling me, without a signature from me anywhere on the deed transfer, which, as it turns out, is a fairly significant legal problem when you're the sole owner of record. Welcome back to Hidden Truth Stories. This is the channel for the moments a family finally learns that trust isn't the same thing as access, and what happens when they mistake one for the other. If a story like this feels uncomfortably familiar, drop a comment and let me know. And before we go further, where are you watching from tonight? Type your city below. I read every single one. My name is Priya Ramaswamy. I'm 36, and I work as a supply chain analyst here in Charlotte. A job that, frankly, does not pay enough on its own to explain how I ended up owning a house outright by 34, which is exactly the kind of question I should have expected my family to eventually ask themselves. And I now understand. Act on, without ever actually asking me. The house came from my grandmother. On my father's side, a woman named Leela, who worked as a seamstress for almost 40 years, and quietly, meticulously saved and invested nearly everything she earned beyond bare necessity. The way an entire generation of immigrants sometimes did, without anyone around them fully realizing the scale of it until much later. When she passed 6 years ago, she left me a modest but genuinely mortgage-free 3-bedroom house in a quiet neighborhood, along with a note that said, in her careful handwriting, "This is yours, not the family's. Keep it that way." I didn't fully understand, at the time, why she'd felt the need to write that second sentence at all. I understood it a great deal better 6 years later, standing in a title company conference room with 2 police officers beside me. My mother, Anita, and my older brother, Devesh, have always occupied a very particular financial relationship with the rest of the family. One built around a series of business ventures that never quite worked out the way they were supposed to. Devesh had started over the years a food truck that folded within 18 months, an import business that lost most of its initial investment, and, most recently, a real estate flipping venture with a business partner who, from what I eventually learned, was considerably less reputable than my brother initially let on. That venture needed capital, fast, roughly 4 months ago, to cover a deposit on a commercial property before a deadline that, if missed, would have cost Devesh and his partner a substantial, non-refundable earnest deposit already paid. My mother, I would later learn, had quietly suggested to Devesh that my grandmother's house, sitting there mortgage-free and, in her words, basically doing nothing, represented an obvious underutilized asset that could solve the entire problem. If only there were a way to access it quickly. If you've ever had family treat something that was legally entirely yours, as though it belonged to the whole family by default, tell me in the comments. What did they assume they had the right to? I found out something was wrong almost by accident, which I've come to understand is how most people discover this particular kind of betrayal, since nobody plans for their own family to forge their signature on a property deed, and therefore nobody thinks to check for it proactively. A neighbor, a retired school teacher named Mrs. Okonkwo, who'd lived 2 doors down since before my grandmother passed, called me on a Tuesday evening to ask, casually, whether I was planning to move soon, since she'd noticed a real estate sign go up in the front yard that weekend, along with what looked like a scheduled open house flyer taped to the door. I told her, confused, that I had no plans to sell anything, and that I'd actually been at that house just 11 days earlier, watering the garden with no sign in sight. I drove over that same evening. The sign was real, a local agent's name and number, a listing price, and taped inside the front window, a printed flyer advertising an open house that had apparently already happened 3 days earlier. One I had never been informed of, for a house I was the sole legal owner of. I called the listing agent directly the next morning, identifying myself clearly as the property owner. There was a long, uncomfortable pause on her end before she said carefully that she'd been retained by my mother, who had represented herself, in writing, as having full authority to sell the property on my behalf through a power of attorney document. I want to be honest about the specific cold clarity that settled over me in that moment, because it wasn't panic, not yet. It was something closer to recognition, the particular sensation of pieces you hadn't consciously assembled suddenly locking into a shape you understood immediately, even before you had all the details. I have never, at any point in my adult life, signed a power of attorney granting my mother, or anyone else, authority over that property. Or any property. I asked the agent to send me a copy of that document immediately. She did, within the hour, clearly rattled herself once she understood the situation. The signature on it was mine, or something built to closely resemble mine, notarized by a notary public whose stamp I didn't recognize, dated 6 weeks earlier, on a day I could account for entirely. Because I had been at a work conference in Nashville, badge scans, hotel records, and a dinner receipt, all placing me nowhere near the notary's listed office address in Charlotte. I called an attorney that same afternoon, a sharp, methodical woman named Renata Fields, who specializes in real estate and elder fraud cases, and laid out everything I had. She confirmed almost immediately what I already suspected: that a forged power of attorney used to execute a property sale is not merely a civil matter to be quietly untangled through paperwork. It's a criminal one, involving forgery and potentially fraud, serious enough that law enforcement involvement wasn't just an option. It was, given the scale and the imminent closing date already scheduled, the correct and necessary one. Second question for you. If you discovered your own family had forged your signature to sell something that was legally yours, would you have confronted them privately first, or gone straight to the authorities the way I eventually did? I did not confront my family immediately. I want to be honest about why, because it wasn't mercy. And it wasn't hesitation either. Renata explained to me clearly that the closing was already scheduled for 11 days out, that the buyers, an unsuspecting young couple who had no idea anything was wrong, had already secured financing and were prepared to sign, and that if I tipped my hand too early, there was a real risk my mother or brother could attempt to accelerate the closing, alter documentation further, or simply disappear with whatever portion of the proceeds they could access, before the fraud was fully documented and law enforcement was formally involved. So I waited. 11 days of behaving outwardly, exactly as I always had. Normal phone calls with my mother about nothing in particular. A birthday dinner for a cousin I attended, as though nothing at all was happening, while quietly, methodically, working with Renata and a detective assigned to the case to build a complete, documented timeline. The forged power of attorney, the fraudulent notarization, my own verifiable location records for the date in question, bank records showing the earnest money deposit from the buyers had already been wired into an account, disturbingly, that my mother had opened, using a slight, easily overlooked variation of my own name. I learned, during those 11 days, exactly how far the plan had gone. My mother had not simply forged a single document. She had opened a bank account under a name close enough to mine to pass a cursory glance, intending to receive and redirect the sale proceeds directly to Devesh's failing real estate venture before I ever noticed the house was gone at all. Had Mrs. Okonkwo not happened to mention a real estate sign in casual conversation, I genuinely don't know how long it would have taken me to discover any of this. Possibly not until well after the money had already moved, somewhere I'd never have been able to recover it from. The detective assigned to the case, a patient, thorough man named Officer Reyes, walked me through exactly how the closing day would unfold, given that we now had enough documented evidence to justify a coordinated response, rather than simply canceling the sale quietly and dealing with the family fallout in private. The title company, once informed discreetly of the situation by Renata the day before closing, cooperated fully, allowing the scheduled signing to proceed as though nothing was wrong, specifically so that everyone involved in the fraud would be present, together, in one room, at the exact moment the truth came out. I walked into that conference room on Thursday morning, at the same time my mother and brother had been told to arrive, flanked by 2 officers, carrying a folder with copies of everything Renata and I had assembled. My mother's face, when she saw me, went through an entire sequence of emotions in the space of about 3 seconds. Confusion, then recognition, then something that looked, unmistakably, like the exact moment a plan collapses entirely inside someone's chest. If this story is hitting a nerve, subscribe so the next one finds you. And tell me honestly, would you have waited the way I did to gather proof first, or confronted them the moment you found out? The buyers, to their credit, were remarkably calm once the situation was explained to them by the title company representative, genuinely horrified to learn they'd nearly purchased a property through a fraudulent transaction, and grateful, repeatedly, that it had been caught before any funds actually changed hands on their end. The sale was voided immediately, on the spot, and the title company's own internal fraud protocols kicked in alongside the police involvement, which meant the entire transaction was formally flagged and unwound within that same conference room. My mother did not deny it. Not really. Not once the documentation was laid out in front of her with 2 officers present. What she said instead, and I've thought about this sentence more times than almost anything else from that entire experience, was, "I was going to tell you eventually, once it was all settled and Devesh's business was stable again. I didn't think you'd even notice for a while, honestly, since you barely go over there." I want to sit with that sentence for a second, because I think it tells you almost everything you need to know about how my mother had come to see that house, and by extension, me. Not as something I owned and cared for and visited regularly enough that a neighbor recognized my absence within days. As an asset, she assumed I wasn't paying close enough attention to, one she genuinely believed she could quietly redirect toward my brother's failing venture, before I noticed, correct it retroactively, and present the whole thing to me later as a decision already made. One I'd simply have to accept, because unwinding it would be too complicated by then. My brother, for his part, said very little in that room, mostly staring at the table, though he did, weeks later, in a private conversation, admit that he'd known about the forged power of attorney from very early on, and had chosen not to say anything because he genuinely believed the venture would succeed. The money would eventually be replaced, and I would, in his words, probably never even find out, honestly, and it would have all worked out fine. I pressed charges. I want to be honest about how difficult that decision was, and how many people in my extended family, once the details spread, quietly suggested I was being excessive, that family disputes over money should stay within the family, that involving the police over something that technically didn't even end up happening was disproportionate. I disagreed then, and I still disagree now. What didn't happen specifically because I caught it in time. With 3 days to spare before an unsuspecting couple would have closed on a house that was never legally for sale in the first place. My mother ultimately pled to a reduced charge, given her age and lack of any prior record, resulting in probation and a formal restitution order covering the legal costs I'd incurred, though we both know that number never fully captured what the entire experience actually cost either of us. Devesh's business partner, as it turned out, had his own considerably larger legal problems entirely separate from this incident. Problems that surfaced publicly not long after, which, in hindsight, explained a great deal about the desperate timeline that had driven the original scheme in the first place. So tell me honestly, in the comments, was I wrong to press charges against my own mother? Or did she forfeit that protection the moment she forged my signature to sell something my grandmother specifically told me to keep? Subscribe if you want more stories like this one, and let me know where you're watching from tonight. I still own the house. I still visit more often now than I used to, if I'm honest. Partly out of a quiet, stubborn need to make sure it stays exactly what my grandmother intended it to be. I found her note again recently, tucked in a kitchen drawer where I'd left it years ago. This is yours, not the family's. Keep it that way. I understand now, far better than I ever wanted to, exactly why she felt the need to write that second sentence at all.